On April 30th, 2006, Jake and Patsy Berg were traveling from Pennsylvania to Oklahoma with their 3 children, Kayla, 12, Weston, 8, and Pearl, 6, when they were involved in a life-threatening car accident. They were taken to the emergency room in Washington City right away, and both parents suffered severe injuries and spent more than a week in a coma. Shortly after they were stabilized, the doctors and nurses had to call the police after noticing some odd and unsettling markings on every member of the family. "We're glad to see you awake, Mr. Berg." The police had a lot of questions that needed to be answered. This is a conversation between Jake Berg and Officer Adam Gardner. "We need to talk about a few things with you. When your family was brought to the emergency room, the doctors and nurses saw that you all had the same scars and markings all over your body. They had to explain that if I didn't like your response, we would have to call child services. Just so you know, the doctors and nurses spoke to your kids and listened. Their perspective, so what you have to say, should be fascinating, to put it mildly, Jake Berg. I'm glad it's public knowledge because we've kept this a secret for so long. I don't think I can handle it anymore. We tried running once, but it didn't help. It all began when Kayla, our first little redhead, was born. We were living in my parents' old house in BRNE, where I grew up from the age of 3 until they both passed away unexpectedly one night when Kayla was just a month old. Initially began. One night, I was asleep in bed when I heard strange noises coming from her room. I woke up, looked at the lovely dark-haired beauty who was lying next to me, and considered waking her up, but I considered going to check on her because I knew how exhausted she was and I didn't have to work the next day. As I was walking down the hallway to her room, I heard the strange noises again, which made me stop and listen. It was strange because it didn't sound like any noise a baby would make. Instead, it sounded almost like talking. What the hell could... When I heard the sound of small but heavy feet running across the hardwood floor, I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. Without thinking, I ran the remaining distance to her room and turned on the light. I went inside expecting to see a rat or some other animal, but there was nothing. I hurried over to her crib and saw that she was wide awake, staring at me, and about to cry, so I picked her up and began culling her. My mind then returned to what I'd... The house was old, so I hoped I was just hearing things. After she fell asleep, I put her back down and went back to bed. And I didn't get much sleep that night, though, because every sound made me jump. When morning finally arrived and I could hear Patsy stirring, I asked, "Did you hear anything?" I heard the strangest noises coming from Kayla's room last night, so I got up and, as I was walking down the hallway, I thought I heard what sounded like a conversation, followed by the sound of tiny but heavy feet. "I didn't hear anything, honey. I thought I might have heard you get up to go check on Kayla, but I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not. I'm surprised she didn't wake up to feed." She said, I heard something. All I could think about that day was what I'd heard, and having an overwhelming desire to protect Kayla at all costs before she came into the world. "Most likely just a mouse or rat. We should get some traps," she said, laughing. Like that, which completely altered the situation. After seeing her, everything was great for a few days. Then, one night at around 11, I had just finished watching an old Annie Griffith Show episode after a long day at work, and while Patsy and Kayla were sleeping, I went to the refrigerator, got a beer, and sat back down on the couch. I remember the heater running, but it stopped once it reached the desired temperature, leaving the house completely silent. I was about to take another swig when I heard the tiny, heavy footsteps again, so I put my beer down right away. Leaped up on the coffee table and raced to her room, which had an open door at night. I ran to the side of her crib and saw that she was in a lot of anguish, and tears began to form in her eyes. "It's okay, baby." As I grabbed her up, I said, "I got you." I turned on the light and began hurriedly searching the room for whatever was making the noise. If it was an animal, I didn't want it to bite Kayla. No. I had to grab those fucking traps that I muttered out loud. As she walked over to take Kayla for me, she said, "I think she needs to be changed, and she's probably hungry." "Maybe," I said as I walked back to finish my beer. As soon as I sat down and took a swig, Patsy blurted out, "Come quick!" And I jumped up like I was on fire. "What's going on, honey?" Patty asked as she entered the room. I'm not sure. I heard something running again, I replied. Are you being serious? I told you to get the traps. What is it? I rushed to the room. I had down to get a closer look after asking in a panic, but Patsy said nothing as she glared down at Kayla's thighs. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but then I realized I wasn't. On Kayla's thigh, there was an odd red and brown marking about an inch long that resembled a bull's horn. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It couldn't be a birthmark because we would have noticed by now, and it was too flawless and detailed to be anything but a tattoo. She looked at me sharply and started to say, "Hey, I had nothing to do with it. How the hell would I do that? Anyway, it looks almost like a tattoo. Should we call the police? They'll think we did it or we're crazy. Either way, we'll be screwed." But I interrupted her. "Orcs. What in Lord's name is that?" I asked. "I have no idea. It certainly wasn't there before," Patsy said, as she tried gently rubbing it off with the baby wipe. "But it wouldn't have been there before." As I sat there watching Patsy change and feed her, I could tell she was thinking deeply too. Perhaps she was beginning to realize what I'd been hearing wasn't so crazy after all. Mere tit. In any case, neither of us knew what to think or what could possibly be going on. We had no idea the underscore that lay there. I thought to myself, what if the thing I'd heard running had something to do with it, knowing that Patsy would think I'm nuts if I pushed it. Before us. The following day, I purchased several traps and placed them throughout the house, but nothing was ever caught. A month passed, and if it weren't for the marking on Kayla's thigh, which served as a constant reminder, we would have forgotten. One Sunday at noon, we were preparing lunch in the kitchen while Kayla was napping, when we heard the odd sounds and conversation I had previously heard coming from her room. Patsy was standing across from me as she dropped the knife she was holding, and it hit the counter with a loud thud. Was going to say, "Did you hear that?" When we heard it again, we dropped everything and rushed to her room. When we got there, we discovered something neither of us had anticipated. Inside Kayla's crib, there were two strange-looking creatures, each about a foot tall with arms and legs that looked red and brown. I stood there in shock for a few seconds before snapping out of it and running to her. I lifted my arm to try to swat the monsters away, but they were too swift and ran out of the crib. I leaned down and pulled the crib skirt underneath it, expecting to see them, but to my astonishment, all I saw were diapers and wipes. I looked up at Patsy, who was frozen in shock and had a terrified expression on her face. Patsy checked on Kayla. I yelled as I kept scanning the room for the animals. A few seconds later, she cried wildly, "Oh my God, Jake, what's going on?" I instantly stopped and turned to face her again. She was staring down at something, and I noticed a drop of blood. When Kayla's arm struck the carpet, I saw that there was a tiny hole on her arm that extended almost to her wrist, and that blood was slowly but steadily dripping from it. As I watched our beige carpet turn red, I also noticed another tiny hole close to the outside of her ankle. What the devil is going on, and how is that even possible? I shouted, I don't know our little baby," with a level of rage I had never seen before. Patsy answered as, When she started bawling, my initial instinct was to contact the police, but I quickly squashed that thought because I knew we would be blamed. I am aware that you will advise us to call the police, but you are aware that we will undoubtedly be held accountable, and that they will take her away from us and commit us to a mental health facility if we even bring up the monsters we see. The strange thing is that Kayla remained utterly composed the entire time, even though she knew I was right, and we had no choice but to keep it a secret. She didn't respond, just kept bawling. When Patsy finally calmed down, I said, "We need to go to the store and get some antibiotic ointment and bandages for her. I don't want to leave you here alone, so you're both coming with me." She just nodded her head, and I got up from the couch and got everything ready as she sat there. At that point, it was almost like she was sedated. I put my arm around Patsy's shoulder and said, "Let's go sit down on the couch." Embracing Kayla, We were unable to comprehend what had just happened, and neither of us spoke as we drove to the store. Shortly after obtaining the required materials, I bandaged Kayla's arm and leg while she was still in her car seat. When I returned to the driver's seat, Patsy was looking out the window. At this point, we have two choices. Either we spend the night at the hotel and decide what to do, or we stay with my older brother and his family in Harrisburg. The issue with remaining with Since money is scarce right now, my brother and I will need a good justification for our stay, as well as an idea of how long we can stay there. Long-term isn't really an option either, maybe a week at most. I told her that she was silent and kept staring out the window, but only after I took her shoulder and said that she turned to face me in terror. I inquired again, either at the motel or at my brother's residence. She responded softly, "Okay, we should return to the house first to get some things, specifically Kayla's baby stuff," and I fired up the car and drove back home. I must admit that I was afraid to get back inside when I pulled into the driveway. I waited until I got out and shut the door before taking a deep breath so Patsy wouldn't know how scared I really was. I can do this, I told myself. As I approached the door, turned the handle, and entered, something felt different, possibly because of what had happened. Because it was the house where I grew up and it made me think of my parents. Though I only felt uneasy and suspicious, the first room I entered was Kayla's because her belongings were the most important. I recall turning on the light and gasping when I saw the words, "No run," written in blood on the wall. My knee began to buckle as I stood there in shock, thinking, what's going on? How can this kind of thing not happen? When I finally snapped out of it, I went about gathering our belongings and, as I placed them by the front door, I considered telling Patsy about the wall or just keep it a secret and clean it off. When I got outside, I put her belongings in the trunk and got into the driver's seat. I asked Patsy, "What took you so long?" and hurried as quickly as I could, knowing full well that it was because I took the time to carefully clean the blood off the wall and dispose of the evidence. I finally decided to keep it to myself because I didn't want her to be stressed out anymore, or worse, have a mental breakdown. I was having a strange dream when I felt something on my foot. I rolled over, thinking it was just. But then something ran up my leg. I yelled out as I threw off the covers, jumped out of bed, and turned on the lamp next to my bed. I wasn't sure if what we saw was real, and what our next course of action should be. All of that changed around 2 a.m. on the second night. "What's going on?" Patsy asked as she woke up. I lifted my leg, grabbed hold of my foot, and saw a small hole similar to Kayla's in the exact same spot. I put my foot down, moved my boxers to the side, and couldn't believe it. There on my thigh was the same red and brown bull's horn. I was seeing things, or still dreaming, and looked down at my right foot, which was now covered in blood. Patsy's mouth was open because she couldn't believe it either. She yelled and pointed to the wall above the TV before turning to something. When I saw the words blood again, I said out loud, "What does it mean? Please don't get upset. I didn't tell you since you were already on the edge of losing it." Jake questioned hurriedly, and I took a deep breath and sighed as I answered, "I have something to tell you. I also spotted this back in Kayla's bedroom when I went to retrieve our belongings. When Kayla started to cry, she grabbed her up from Patsy's side of the bed and started feeding her while I went to sit. I sat down on one of the chairs and tried to process everything. I looked at the writings on the wall for a long time and thought, maybe we really can't outrun whatever these things are. At about 4 a.m., I wrapped my foot and went back to sleep. Even though we wanted to attempt running away from these things, we couldn't afford it at the time, and if we did, would it even work? We didn't want to move in with my parents. If you could call it sleep that day, we spent hours discussing what to do. Brother or any of her family members out of concern that we would bring them along, so we made the difficult decision to remain in the house. Years passed as life does, except the GGA, who come to visit us every few days in the middle of the night, take the blood they need from one of us, and then vanish, leaving a tiny hole in the same location as the person they took blood from before, then sealing it up when they're finished. I suppose this is so they can keep feeding on us, which is why there is a horn mark on each of our thighs. As you can see, the rest of our bodies are covered in tiny circular scars. I'm sure you've already noticed that every year we get a new and distinctive marking somewhere on our bodies, but it's never on our hands or above our necks. I assumed this was for obvious reasons. The saddest thing is that our kids believe it's a regular part of life, despite our firm warnings that they should never tell anyone or else their parents will be taken away. One day, Parole asked me why they were constantly bleeding me, and that was heartbreaking because I had no answer. But everything changed one day last summer when I was down in the basement fixing some sheetrock, and I saw an envelope behind it. I took it out and saw the word "give" written on the front. I said out loud, "What the hell is this?" and opened it to find a letter dated August 5, 1969 that said, "Do not bring a newborn into this house." The letter continued by saying that they must start with a newborn and that once they do, it will never end. They're called, and they need human blood to survive. That's all that was written, but it was enough. A few days later, when Patsy and I were out to dinner, I showed her the letter. I wanted to leave the house in case they listened to us, so we decided to try to run the following spring, even though we knew it might be pointless. We chose Oklahoma because we hoped it would be far enough away, but also because Patsy's mom was born in Cherie. I told her I would let her know the day we were leaving, just in case. I approached her and whispered in her ear that it was time to run. She looked me in the eyes, nodded, and packed a few things before we ran. We were on the freeway leaving Pennsylvania when I remembered a car crossing the median at his head. I woke up here after Jake finished telling his story, and after speaking with his superiors, Officer Gardner decided to call Jake's brother in Harrisburg to come get the kids while Jake and Patsy were out. Would be held for a psychological evaluation that evening. Jake and Patsy and the children were all in separate rooms when Jake's heart rate monitor flatlined. The doctors and nurses hurried to his room after the nurse who arrived first claimed to have seen something swiftly disappear beneath Jake's bed. They attempted to revive him, but it was too late. The coroner's investigation showed that Jake's body had been completely drained of blood, and 5 minutes later, Patsy flatlined her. 20 minutes after Patsy passed away, the attending physician instructed one of the nurses to go check on the kids and take them to his office so he could deliver the heartbreaking news to them. A few minutes later, she rushed to the doctor's office, acting hysterical, and said, "They're gone, the sheets are covered in blood." The hospital was searched right away, but the kids were not there. The police started looking for them, but they couldn't find any photos of them, which was challenging. There is no record of what happened to the house they left from, and Jake's brother in Harrisburg told them he hadn't spoken to his brother in over 15 years and had never met his nieces and nephews. If you want to read more terrifying horror stories, then subscribe.